So welcome to the HELSUS Global South Encounters with me, Franklin Obeng-Odoom, Associate Professor of Sustainability Science with Global Development Studies as the chair. If you would like to stay connected between the encounters, I would like to draw your attention to our new Twitter accounts and just ecological political economy, the HELSUS Global South blog, links to which you can see in the chat box. The question of climate finance dominated the just ended COP27, nicknamed the African COP. Much has been said about obtaining a breakthrough for the Global South in terms of the agreement to establish a separate fund to compensate vulnerable Global South countries for their loss and damage. The details of this fund are yet to be finalized. How transformative will they be? Does loss and damage reflect vulnerability or responsibility? Was all this another talk shop? How well have countries in the global north honored their past commitments to climate compensation, itself entangled in the micro and macro politics of net zero? At the root of these issues is what equity and justice mean within the context of net zero. Dr. Jessica Omukuti, our speaker today, has spent most of her academic life researching these questions. A research fellow with the Institute for Science, Innovation, and Society in the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography at the University of Oxford. Dr. Omukuti works on and leads the Oxford Net Zero engagements with stakeholders in the Global South. Bridging the northern and southern divide is no easy matter, but Omukuti has become adept at doing so. She forges these linkages on the book review pages of Progress in Development Studies, for which she is the book review editor. Omukuti took her PhD at the University of Reading, where she studied climate justice and equity in climate finance. For most of us in this room, this represents the highest academic qualification to talk about achievements in studying such important and pressing issues of climate justice in our time. But in the thesis on Feuerbach, the German social scientist Karl Marx noted, and I quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it," unquote. For years, political economists interpreted this thesis to mean that we should try to change the world rather than merely theorizing or doing PhDs about it. But Tricontinental, a vibrant and valiant network of research communities in the Global South, has begun insisting that, in fact, this thesis 11, as it is popularly known or called, means that action and practical experience are more important than ideas, reflecting a well-known view by Bell Hooks, the eminent Black feminist, that there is indeed authority in experience. In the words of Tricontinental, and I quote, Marx is saying that it is those who try to change the world that have a better sense of its constraints and possibilities, for they come upon what Frantz Fanon calls the granite block of power, property, and privilege that prevents an easy transition from injustice to justice, unquote. From this perspective too, Omukuti is the right person to give today's talk. She has extensive practitioner experience with international NGOs such as Mercy Cause and Care International. An activist in her own right, Dr. Omukuti has worked with international finance institutions such as the Green Climate Fund. So whether in theory or in practice, education or experience, ideas or action, Dr. Jessica Omukuti is the best person to give today's talk. So perhaps, Dr. Omukuti, let's get right into your groundbreaking and agenda-setting work by beginning with your analysis, followed by questions and comments by all of us, and you can respond. For the audience, our practice is to mute our microphones, unmuting only when I invite you to do so. But questions can be sent to co-host in the personalized chat box. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Franklin. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Franklin's introduction was really good. I honestly don't think I am as good as he described me, but I really hope that at least what I talk about today will resonate with you. My background, I don't know how to describe myself. I did a bachelor's in meteorology, so I was trained as a climate scientist, and then I went on to do a year of development studies, but I really don't think, I don't consider myself as a development studies expert. And so I'm kind of in between. My work is grounded in practical work. I rarely deal with theories, but I hope that the audience today is at least you'll find some of what I talk about quite relatable, interesting, but also you can learn from it. At Oxford Net Zero, so I work. I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford. I'm working for a program called Oxford Net Zero, and my work, I'm mostly interested in the concept of net zero itself. So we're quite critical of net zero. So net zero has emerged as a very all-encompassing, but not really all-encompassing, as a dominant framework for defining climate action, particularly for emission reductions. And so it's enshrined in the Paris Agreement in some way, but also has been taken up quite broadly for how we address climate change through emission reductions. My work looks at it much more critically. We think about whether the framework itself, how it creates or reinforces inequities and injustices, particularly in the global south, and so that's emerging markets and developing countries, but also how we can restructure or we can use the net zero framework to enable much more inclusive processes towards addressing climate change, but also ensuring that we address pre-existing, but also emerging inequities and injustices. And so it's very comprehensive. We look at how we take a very whole of economy approach. We look at countries, we look at regions, and so it's very much kind of nested within. It's not like we're looking at a very specific group or scale, or economy or sector. So it's much more interrelated and interconnected. Today, I'll just talk to you about what we understand net zero to be, and probably just start kind of bringing out some of the equity and justice concerns that we've identified. But also towards the end of the session, I'll talk about how some of those concerns that we've identified earlier have started being implemented or started being addressed. And this is kind of just reflecting back on what has happened over the past 2 or 3 years, but also what happened at COP27. And so it's a bit all over the place, but I hope at the end of it, you start seeing the coherent picture of what is net zero, what are the concerns in relation to justice and equity, particularly for the global south, and then see how are these at least being addressed, beginning to be addressed. I know we have an hour, so I know we terminate at the top of the hour, and so I'll take about 20 or 30 minutes, and then if you have any questions, please do let me know. So I will just try and find my PowerPoint. There it is. So yeah, there it is. So I work for Oxford Net Zero, and then so a point of starting is the Paris Agreement, which is a global agreement on how signed by most of the states globally, on how we address climate change. And for those in the room, I assume that you know the weight, and the implications of climate change globally. It's we've been discussing climate change from as early as the 80s and the 90s. It became a very big thing in the 2000s, and much more recently we've seen it kind of come up. And the Paris Agreement, Article 4, paragraph 1 says that in order to achieve a long-term temperature goal that was set out in Article 2, and Article 2 of the Paris Agreement says that we should aim for limiting temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And 2 degrees Celsius is relative to pre-industrial levels, which was about 1850 when the Industrial Revolution started. And so aiming to reduce temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, parties, which are countries, states in these countries, in this case, should aim to reach a global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. But also the Paris Agreement recognizes that peaking of emissions will take longer for developing country parties, which is quite important. And so I've highlighted that in bold, but also it says that while we look to peak emissions as soon as possible, we should undertake very rapid reductions thereafter, in accordance with the best available science to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks. In the second half of the century, and on the basis of equity in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. It's a very loaded paragraph. Actually, I feel like it's just a sentence. It is a sentence. I don't see any full stop somewhere there. So it's a very loaded sentence. It talks about when we should reduce our emissions, when we should peak, who should reduce it, who should go first, but also how we should do it. And so balancing anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals is kind of the key here. It's where the concept of net zero was actually enshrined in a global agreement. And that's where net zero starts. And so net zero itself says that we should achieve emissions, we should reduce our emissions and make sure that we balance them by sources and by sinks. And basically it just means that according to the Paris Agreement, we peak our emissions as soon as possible. And according to this simulation by the World Resources Institute, hypothetically, we peak our emissions by 2025, and then we start reducing them rapidly thereafter. And so our emissions are actual emissions that actually go into the atmosphere, start reducing, but also at some point we start balancing those out with removals by sinks. And so by sources, we reduce how much we put out there, and then we also start reducing how much is out there by sinks. And so we sink much more carbon, or let's use carbon in this case, but also we reduce how much we emit. And then we get to a point where the amount of emissions that we're putting out into the atmosphere is kind of balanced out by the amount of emissions that we're taking back from the atmosphere. And that is a state of net zero. And so it's called net zero, where we kind of, in a way, our emissions are not causing any more additional warming to the atmosphere. And that is a very simplistic definition of what net zero means. And so it's where we get to a point where our emissions are not causing any additional warming in the atmosphere. And that ideally should be a point where at 1.5 degrees, when we reach 1.5 degrees of warming, any additional ton of carbon should not be causing any more warming, so that we're able to stabilize warming to 1.5. That is very simple kind of on a basis. That is what net zero means. And so that is, as you can see how I've described it, is a very scientific concept. It's just, ton of carbon, out there, ton of carbon back, how much emissions does that equal? How much warming does that cause? What sources and sinks will you be using? How do you make sure that your additional ton of carbon does not cause any additional warming? And so that net zero itself means that it looks at net zero itself as a target. We aim to reach net zero by this specific year, but also it provides a framework for how we do things. And so we look at it in terms of how do we, when do we peak our emissions? When do we start reducing our emissions? What sources, what sinks do we use? What mechanisms will we require for us to be able to balance our emissions by sinks? And so, but then we realize that even though we're going for a 1.5 goal where we achieve net zero and we hold global warming to 1.5, we realize that our current policies are nowhere near the level of ambition that we're looking for. For example, if you look at the graph on my left, we find that whatever countries have committed to at the moment will take us to way above 2 degrees of warming. And so the unconditional NDC's pledges so far take us to way above 2 degrees of warming, which is not even near the target that the Paris Agreement demands. But also, if we wanted to, if we wanted to get to the 1.5 degrees, then we'd have to have a very, very rapid decline in emissions. We'd have to peak much earlier. For example, for a 1.5 degree range, it has a peaking of about 2020, and then a very rapid decline thereafter. And that means that there's need for a very huge transformation in how our economies are structured, in how we generate our food, in how we create income, in how we live ourselves, in a way that we can quickly transition to low emissions. We were supposed to transition by 2020, and now there's talks about peaking our emissions by 2030 and then reducing them much rapidly after that. But my point here with this slide is that, we have policies that are committed towards reducing emissions, but even then they're not as ambitious, at least not ambitious enough to reach the goal that we have set out by, that has been set out within the Paris Agreement. But then people have kind of jumped onto the net zero framework. There's been a lot of support for the net zero framework. And so here we have data from the net zero tracker, which was co-developed by my colleagues at the University of Oxford and a few other institutions. And here we find that since as early as 2018 to date, there's been a lot of commitments on net zero. And so right now there are people are committing to reducing the emissions, at different times. There's 2020, 2030, 2040, reaching net zero by those dates. And so our assessment finds that about 83% of global emissions have been covered by net zero commitments. About 91% of GDP based on purchasing power parity has been covered by net zero commitments. And also about 80% of the global population is covered by a net zero target. And so we have institutions, large companies, even smaller companies. We have nation states which have committed to reaching net zero. We have cities and regions that have also committed reaching net zero, and the commitments are very far wide reaching. And when you look at these, you're like, where maybe we are, even if we're just off the 1.5 mark, it is probably we're near there, 91% of GDP or 80% of the population. That is a fair enough, that is really good progress, given that we're really far off. We're hoping to get to 2050 and, to 1.5 by 2050. If we have 80% of the population now, then it means that by 2050, we may have achieved, we may have increased our ambition. Another achievement of the net zero framework itself is that there's now more actors involved in climate action, particularly climate action based on net zero. And so, as I said, there's companies, there's institutions, cities and regions that have made net zero commitments. And so according to data that I pulled off the net zero tracker today, there's about 800 companies that have set targets. There's about 116 regions that have also set targets for net zero. 139 countries globally also have a net zero target, and about 241 cities have a net zero target. And that is a very high level assessment because there's other smaller entities that have set targets. But one thing that I'm trying to say here is that the net zero framework itself, the goal of reaching net zero by 2050, but also the framework of how we do it, has been able to galvanize action that is much more far-reaching than any other agreement we've seen so far. And so, if anyone here knows about the history of climate action at the global level, you'll know that there's been so many agreements from as early as 1992. But none of those really got as much traction as what we've seen after the Paris Agreement. And so the Paris Agreement and then bringing in the net zero framework has been able to galvanize action, particularly from the private sector. And so the 800 companies, but also the non-state actors, the cities and the regions have come together to actually set emission targets. But then thinking about that framework itself is issues about the equity concerns from net zero. And so one thing is, first of all, what does a net zero commitment look like? So a net zero commitment from, let's say, a company that deals in food and beverage would be something in the form of, we know as a company, we know that our emissions are X gigatons per year, or we've emitted this much carbon since 2015 to date, and we expect that we want to reach net zero by 2050. And so this is what we will do between now and 2050 to reach net zero by then. And so usually it has a timeline, it has a target, how much emissions you reduce, the mechanisms that you will reduce. But the problem with the net zero itself is that it has an issues with the timelines and responsibilities. And so one thing is that net zero itself is seen as something that should be achieved by the middle of the century. And so And so if you remember the first slide that I showed you about the Paris Agreement, it's saying that entities, parties should commit to reducing the emissions and reaching net zero by mid-century. And so the mid-century timelines initially, I think at the very start, sometime last year and even before that, was seen as being very far off. And anyone who was making commitments would be saying that, we will reduce our emissions by 2050. And we hope to, we hope to do that through a number of mechanisms. And so it was kind of just a very far off target. And in between, entities or cities or regions or countries would not really say how they would do that, but also how progress would be assessed in between. And so it would be quite difficult to kind of come back to an entity and ask them, well, you said you'd reach 2050, a target by 2050. What are you doing in between that? Because there were no measurements, there were no metrics, there were no targets in between. And so in a way, it excuses continued emissions, because if you're not holding anyone accountable to what they do between now and 2050, you only are holding them accountable at 2050, then entities can do whatever they want. And getting to 2050, it's a very far off time. I mean, it's half of the people, half of the population we have right now may not be there by 2050. We may have new populations, we will have new people in leadership who may get there and decide, well, we really did not achieve this target, and so let's set another one. So the mid-century timelines it's kind of kicking the ball down the road, is kind of just passing on that responsibility to a future generation. And so that is an intergenerational equity. So it's who bears the burdens of a mid-century timelines. Is it the people right now, or is it the people who will be in power by 2045? Is it them who will actually have to reduce those emissions? But also not about the reductions of emissions then, it's also about the management of sinks then, because net zero requires that you manage your emissions you balance your emissions by sources and sinks, which means that you'll have to create mechanisms that actually capture and store carbon from the atmosphere. And these involve, nature-based solutions such as wetlands, we have woodlands. We also have engineered storage mechanisms, but those will need to be managed, because let's say if you put carbon into a farm, you just cannot walk away. You need to keep managing it so that the carbon stays there. And so the burden of managing those sinks is kind of seemed like it was being passed on to future generations, which was quite unfair because they have very limited responsibility for current emissions. And then a third equity concern for net zero is that it relies more on technocentric plans, because a lot of the targets that were being set were based on, as they were so far off, but most of them were assuming that there'd be a technology created in the future that would help them to actively capture and store carbon from the atmosphere. So far, there's not been any scalable technology, at least not to the scale that is required to reach net zero by then. And so the technocentric plans means that you're kind of relying on something that doesn't exist yet. You don't even know how it will look like. You don't know the implications of those technologies on communities, but also on the economy, on social and ecological system. And so the reliance on technocentric plans kind of put to doubt the feasibility of some of these emission reduction plans. But also the net zero framework itself does not really say much about historical emissions. And so there's companies, there's institutions and countries that have contributed the most towards emissions, but then net zero itself as a framework does not require them to account for the historical emissions. And so there's kind of a bit of let's call it democracy on what companies or cities or regions or countries decide to do on what a baseline is. So what do you measure your baseline? And so we've seen institutions, entities say that our baseline is 2015. We will reduce our emissions by 40% based on a 2015 baseline. And you're sitting there, you're like, dude, you've been in operation for the last 100 years. What happens to your emissions back for the last 100 years? Do those just go up in flames? Does someone else take care of them? And in that case, who takes care of those emissions? And so the historical emissions of countries, cities, regions, and corporations and businesses are not really accounted for in net zero. And then lastly is the limited concern for development or adaptation. And so as I've described so far, you've heard me talk about net zero as a framework for mainly reducing emissions. And so there hasn't really been a very solid discussion on what happens to countries or regions that have very limited emissions to reduce. What happens to regions that still need to develop, or regions that need to adapt to climate change risks? Because there's regions that are already adapting to climate change risks right now. And in that case, it's a 1.1 degree of warming. And so 1.1 degree of warming is all the terrible things you've heard happen in the world. And so it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, it's the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, it is the wildfires in Australia. So that's 1.1. And so when we get to 1.5, net zero as a framework assumes that it will be all great, in future. And so we go to 1.5, whoever needs to adapt right now, they'll find other ways to do it. But then we get there, we're all good, we've reduced our emissions. And so there's really there's no scope for how net zero can support development or adaptation, but also how net zero enables countries to get ahead of the curve so that you're able to adapt even to the extreme future that we're heading to. And then another set of equity concerns for net zero is the governance of net zero itself. And so, as I said earlier, there's really unclear targets. There's no clarity on what's midterm, or we call them interim targets. What happens between now and 2050 when companies or countries are planning on getting to their net zero targets. But also, there's a very huge gap between policy ambition and implementation, because it's one thing to say that by 2030 I will go and start eating salads. It's another thing to actually start eating salads and actually doing it, because rarely a lot of the commitments that we saw like in 2019, 2020, and in early 2021, there was a very huge ambition. And when you start questioning them, you'd ask, how exactly are you going to achieve this? There wasn't really any clarity on the mechanisms for achieving that. And so you'd find that there was kind of a gap between ambition and implementation. There were institutions that had made commitments much earlier, but had not done much in between. And so you're like, okay, you had ambition, but you're really doing less to achieve the implementation of those targets. And then lastly, one of the equity concerns we're seeing is that there's an outsourcing of climate action to non-state actors. And so if you remember the slide that I showed you about who's made commitments, we had countries doing their part, but also most of the work has been taken up by the non-state actors, who are cities and regions, but also corporations or businesses. And so that is it is seen as an inequity, because states should be responsible, at least some arguments state that states should be responsible for emission reductions within their borders, because they have the capacity to control the laws. They can set laws and regulations. They can control who emits and who doesn't, and so they should be the ones setting targets, as opposed to outsourcing climate action to non-state actors. Although there's emerging literature that says that climate action is a responsibility for both states and non-state actors, because consumption of emissions does not really happen at the state level. It happens at the individual, at corporations, at cities. And so that responsibility should not be on states for us to actually be able to transition to the level of emission reductions that we need. And so that is kind of just two sets of equity concerns from net zero. I decided to cluster them into two sections so that you can see that, and they're not quite distinct because they kind of feed back into each other, but they demonstrate some of the issues about ambition and responsibility, but also how net zero itself is governed. But then these are concerns that we heard much earlier on, about two years ago. One thing we've observed is that there has been a transition. There's been thinking on how do we address some of these concerns. And so one is a recognition within the communities, within the spaces where net zero itself is discussed or structured, or where net zero commitments are made, is a recognition that equity and justice and just transitions are important for net zero. But also it's kind of recognizing that for net zero to be done right, or for net zero to actually have the long-term impact that it's expected, it has to align with the Paris Agreement, because countries did sign up to the Paris Agreement, and so it's an agreement. And so if it doesn't fit within that framework, then it will basically lose that support from both cities, but also the general public. And so, as I said, it's also important, equity itself is important for the long-term achievement of net zero, so that we get to net zero and we keep it that way. And so here I'd just like to outline three eras, in a way, where we've seen the evolution of how some of the equity and justice concerns that I mentioned earlier have started being kind of addressed or not addressed. And we have a pre-COP26 period, which was basically anything before November of last year. And then we have a between COP26 and COP27, which is everything that has happened between last year, November, and this year, November. And then after COP27, which is whatever the period that happened between when COP27 started and then today, which is probably about 2 or 3 weeks at most. And so I'll just kind of tell you a story about what has happened and how I think this is good or not good, and then I'll wrap up from there. So the first kind of era is what I call the up for grabs period, where it's anything between let's say as early as when the Paris Agreement was developed to November 2021, just before the COP, where net zero was mostly adopted by leaders, where it is those companies or countries that saw an opportunity for net zero and they just jumped onto it and set net zero commitments. They worked with their shareholders. There was really not much guidance on how to do it, but there were some leaders who did set up targets. And so we call this the pace setters, who determined what they thought was possible. And so, when you're a leader, you set the pace, you decide what can be done, and people do follow your lead. But then there's a report, a stock take that was done by my team in 2021, I think, that found that about one in five companies within the global 2000s Forbes list of publicly listed companies had a net zero target. And so that is a very small number of companies. And that is what we call the leaders, who set the targets, who set what we thought was quite important for net zero. But then any assessments on net zero so far focused on whether companies aligned with the Paris temperature goal. So it was just about, are your emission reductions aligned with the 1.5 goal? It wasn't much more than that. And so equity was just mostly considered as something, something that you could just say you were doing without really justifying how you were doing it. And so entities that were making commitments were asked to identify how they were contributing to equity and justice in net zero with respect to the Paris Agreement. And mostly it was just a box ticking. And so I've seen some of that where they ask you, have you considered equity and justice in your net zero strategy or your net zero plan? And companies are like, I have, but there's really you're not asked to justify how you're doing that. But then within that is where we start seeing kind of concerns for the implications of what these commitments mean for human rights, but also what these commitments mean for the actual emissions within the atmosphere. And so even though there is kind of a box ticking exercise for equity and justice, because we have leaders setting targets and are considered sustainability heroes, there's also kind of an emerging concern for what net zero means for human rights. And so back then we'd hear conversations about offsets, and how offsets led to land grabs and displacements, and how they fail to benefit specific groups. And so that's where we see emergence of concerns for human rights. And then the second here is kind of generally we see this period as one that is kind of called, generally just making a commitment is sufficient for just transitions and net zero. If you're making a commitment, you're a hero, you're contributing to the greater good, and so you're the best. And then second is the second period where we say, I kind of call it the choose period, where it's kind of after COP26. And I remember after COP26, we had a lot of commitments. We had companies coming up and saying, we're doing this great thing called net zero. But then the mass adoption of net zero led to a lot of kind of concern from the public, but also from other civil society actors who were like, if everyone is making net zero commitments, how good are this? And so here is where we kind of found a lot of concern for the credibility of these pledges. And then equity, justice, and just transitions were now kind of beginning to be considered as a determinant for the credibility of pledges, where they say that you may have made a pledge, you may consider yourself a leader, but the credibility of that commitment is only dependent on whether you have equity and justice and just transitions concerns integrated into those. And so, but within this period, we start seeing an emergence of ways of determining credibility in relation to equity and justice and just transitions, where we see people saying or institutions saying that you can only be considered to have integrated equity and justice if your commitments go beyond carbon or go beyond value chain emissions. So beyond carbon is saying that you're not just reducing your carbon emissions or capturing your carbon emissions, you're also capturing your methane, your nitrous oxide, you're capturing your other your other greenhouse gases, because those will result in much quicker emission reductions. But also you're told that you're only equitable or just if you're going beyond your value chain emissions. And so value chain emissions are whatever you create along your business. And so you're told that you should do more than that. You should help others to reduce their emissions, and that will result in much quicker emission reductions by 2050. And so it's assumed that equity and justice is basically just fair share, where you're creating much more space in the atmosphere. So going beyond value chain emission is basically just creating a bit more space in the atmosphere to help particularly those who cannot reduce the emissions immediately, to have a bit more space. For example, having developing countries peak their emissions a bit later, but also helping them to reduce the emissions much quicker after that. And so here we also see commitments on human rights and resource issues and actual emissions still kind of featuring, where we still see concerns about the roles of offsets. If you're going to use offsets to reduce your emissions, what are the implications of those on human rights, particularly on indigenous groups, on local communities? But what we also see is an emergence of a labor-focused, kind of very labor-focused concerns for equity and justice. So for example, here, it's kind of where they say that your commitment or your strategy for net zero is equitable or just, or ensures just transitions if you're able to account for the effects of your decarbonization efforts on the communities that are reliant on fossil fuels. And so it's your coal mining community, your oil mining communities, or your oil manufacturing communities. And so we see here that the concern for just transition that is focused on labor brings in some of the just energy transition partnerships that if some of you some of you are aware of those. They kind of it's funding decarbonization efforts within the economy, but that mostly focus on reskilling communities that are affected by the divestment from fossil fuels. But also within this period is where we see that entities are still required to self-identify how they contribute to equity and justice. And so here is where you're not it's not a mandate. You're not really like forcibly required to go beyond carbon. You're not forcibly required to go beyond value chain emissions. You choose to do that. And still, so those who choose to go beyond carbon, or those who choose to look at, their labor-focused just transitions, I thought as being leaders, and the leadership component, so it's kind of featuring into this. And a later stock take done by the University of Oxford with a few other partners, the Energy and Climate Institute and the Data-Driven Action Lab and New Climate Institute, found that now 1 in 3 companies on the Forbes 2000 list of publicly listed companies have net zero targets. And so we see that the number of companies that have targets is increasing, which is quite good, but still equity and justice it's a bit better, but then it's still kind of very, very it's not really complementary. It's still a choice. You can choose what to do. You can choose how to do it. And you're not really, so, you say if you don't do it, then you lack credibility, but there's still really not that much significant repercussions on it. And then lastly, here is kind of what I see this as is a period where there's a localized approach to equity and justice. And so it's within communities, within very specific localities. No one really cares about what happens outside of that. No one cares about what happens to, outside, beyond the fossil fuel production. So what happens to everyone else? What happens to your emissions that you're producing between now and 2050? What happens to the countries that you're divesting from? There's it's a very localized approach to equity and justice. And because it's a choice approach, there's still not really limited kind of consistency. There's still very limited consistency on how anyone who's making commitments actually approaches this. And then lastly is what we've seen occur over the last, since the last COP at COP27, where we've seen a bit of thought into what equity and justice means. And so it's beginning to emerge where there's consideration for the special circumstances of developing countries, but also consideration for what net zero means for small and medium-sized enterprises. And so it's not just that, everyone should go beyond, beyond carbon or do beyond their fair share of emissions. It's thinking about, if you're going beyond carbon, you should go beyond carbon, you should go beyond your value chain, but make sure that whatever you're doing is not adversely affecting developing countries or small and medium-sized enterprises. And also equity and justice here is actually there's an infiltration of concepts where historical contributions, capacity to pay, and the effect of current and past climate change are being integrated into what we understand net zero to be. For example, now what anyone who's making commitments is asked to account for the historical contribution at least. There's also, as I said, awareness of any net zero commitments should take into consideration the capacity to pay for these emission reductions, and saying that if an SME, if a small and medium-sized enterprise that is within your value chain does not have the data to reduce the emissions or cannot reduce the emissions, then you should enable them to do that, but not actually punish them for not being able to do that. But they're also thinking about what net zero can actually help in terms of addressing current and past climate change. For example, there's now thinking about what should an institution that is making a net zero commitment, what responsibility does it have towards everyone who's been affected by climate change so far? And it's kind of that's expanding net zero to not just be a framework for just emission reductions, but also a framework for enabling development, adaptation and resilience, but then broader sustainable development. And here is where we see that there's kind of a requirement that if you're making net zero commitments, you should think about where you're investing your low emissions, where you're making low emissions investments, where you're divesting, what effect does your divestment have on different groups, on different countries or markets, and how can you cushion those economies or markets or regions against the negative effects of those. And so we see some of this, for example, the Integrity Matters report that was released at COP27 actually articulates some of this, but also we have research that's coming up that actually much more articulates that. For example, this Nature Energy paper that says that any net zero, any energy future, energy pathway in Africa needs to be based on context relevant evidence that enables countries to achieve their development goals, their resilience and adaptation goals, but also enables them to achieve energy security. And so it's saying that we need context specific approaches to reach net zero, but also to generally reach net zero. And so basically here is where we see justice now emerging from justice and equity emerging in net zero, where it says that determining overall progress, it's kind of going beyond labor to determine the overall progress on equity and justice, and saying that it's not just labor that determines equity and justice or just transitions, it's how communities fare in the face of transitions to net zero by 2050. And that's it. So basically, yeah, so kind of, as I said, it's a very, very jumbled up story, but I think the overall message here in summary is that we started off with net zero as a framework, but as a scientific concept, and we've seen it kind of transition into a framework that has really gotten a lot of support, particularly from the non-state actors, and that is cities, regions, and corporations in general. But then there were equity concerns that were highlighted from the very beginning, but we're starting to see those being kind of addressed slowly. Generally, those, it's just, most of these are guidelines. It's just kind of, it's guidance given to whoever is setting up, targets or commitments. And so what is needed right now is translating those guidelines into policies to ensure that anyone who's making commitments actually takes care of their historical emissions, adaptation, resilience, talks about governance of net zero, without actually just saying that we will do something without actually providing evidence of how it's done. I really hope that was useful. So, and I'm happy to take any questions.